Welcome back to Every Third House by Margery Frisbie. Chapter 14. I think I'm ready for the insanity file, Tracy decided firmly as she helped her grandmother carry in the bags from the jewel store. The geranium plants Grandma couldn't resist because they're so cheerful, bobbled over the tops of sacks bulky with oranges and bananas. Grandma held the door with her shoulder as Tracy edged in, cumbersome bags in both arms. You could more easily have made 2 trips, Grandma remonstrated mildly. Her mind was really on pleasing Grandpa. He'd like soup and so would I. I'm chilled to the bone. But we had soup for lunch. How about this nice whole wheat rotini? She was lifting groceries out of the bag. I could stir fry it with the broccoli and carrots. Grandma surprised Tracy sometimes. Mostly she was a meat and potatoes kind of person, but there was a tilt to her personality that sometimes made her dump dumplings and fix something unexpected. That's okay, Tracy agreed, already half out of the kitchen. Do you need any help? She said over her shoulder. You could sliver the carrots for me. Mrs. Burkhart ignored Tracy's reluctant return to the kitchen momentarily. Then she relented. I don't like to see you closeted in your room all the time with those books, she admitted. I worry about you in there. Tracy reached out for the cutting board and knife her grandmother offered her. I'll do the carrots for you, but you shouldn't worry about me. I just have to study. As she sliced across the resistant pith of the fat yellow vegetables, Tracy reflected that up till now she'd been pretty much stuck to kids' books about Mary Lincoln. She'd almost hidden the insanity file from herself, bypassed it on new bookshelves at least once, and carted it home unwillingly. What am I afraid of, she wondered. Why haven't I been able to open it? Dinner's in about 20 minutes, Grandma reminded Tracy as she handed over the carrots and made her escape. Your grandfather likes rotini, those little bits of spices clinging to the curls, and the whole wheat is nutritious. Her grandmother's voice followed Tracy down the hall. Said it sounded good to him. Sounds good to me, Tracy agreed, but now for Mary Lincoln. As if an adult book carried more weight by definition than a kid's book, Tracy didn't flop on the bed with The Insanity File. She carried it to the lilac-patterned boudoir chair she'd inherited from Grandma. It didn't quite fit Tracy's shape. The bulges were in the wrong places. Tracy couldn't get comfortable in it. Somehow she suspected that Mary Todd Lincoln would prefer that she, Tracy, not be too comfortable. No one was allowed to be terribly comfortable around Mary Lincoln. Wriggling around, trying her legs over the arm, slouching into the down cushion, Tracy poked through the first pages, noting how often Mary Lincoln discomforted people with her imperious demands. It seemed to Tracy that everyone in Mary Lincoln's family only wanted the best for her. But Mary Lincoln tied their hands in all kinds of ways, making it impossible for family plans, however good, to work out. Robert Lincoln had it the hardest. After Tad died, he was responsible for his mother. Robert had lost a brother in Springfield, another brother when he was in college, and a third, young Tad, after his father was assassinated. Once Robert was left with his mother, she gave him no peace. She would lavish gifts on Robert and his wife, spending money to exorcise the ghost of her sorrow. Actually, she spent, rather overspent, on everything she saw, much of it useless. Poor Robert tried to restrain her so she wouldn't end her life penniless. Mary Lincoln did not appreciate his concern or his interference. As a result, she turned on her remaining son and turned him into the enemy. Actually, at the time Tracy was reading about, 1875, Mary Lincoln's chief concern was Robert Lincoln's health. In Florida, far from her only son, she fantasized him prostrate, dying, too ill to receive a telegram. She called him my dearly beloved son, begging him in a message sent through his law partner to rouse himself and live for my sake. She went on to pledge that she was praying every moment for your life to be spared to your mother. Having experienced Mary Lincoln's changes of heart and her paranoia, Robert surmised that her fears for her health were a sign of a new bout of her emotional disorder. Tracy got up and bunched up a pillow against her headboard. She needed a soft pillow to temper hard thoughts, she told herself. Because she understood the tangled web, there I go, Shakespeare again, of Mary Lincoln's mind, Tracy could see, almost understand, how Mary Lincoln could have hatched the idea that her only son, her only surviving son, was dying. Up to today, Tracy herself had believed that nothing good would ever happen to her again, that she would catapult from disaster to disaster like Mary Lincoln. She looked up from the insanity file to the pile of Lincoln books on her dresser. "You poor people," she said to the Lincolns. "It wasn't bad enough that Eddie should die, and then Willie, and then Tad. It wasn't brutal enough that Abraham Lincoln should be killed when you and the country needed him the most. And then, when there were only two of you left, there was no peace for either of you." Poor Mary. Full of the delusion she tried to bury under the accumulation of possessions. Poor Robert, trying to restrain her excesses. Tracy felt now that she could understand Robert's quandary. Back fidgeting in her lilac chair, she found herself commiserating with troubles a century old. She wanted to reach out to Robert and convince him of her empathy. Maybe she could relate to him her confusion that summer after her father died, when she had visited her mother in the hospital for some minor surgery. It had been hot that day, and she'd shivered walking into that icy, antiseptic crypt in a sleeveless blouse. Later she couldn't separate the shakes she got from the air conditioning from her shock at her mother's announcement that she didn't want to come home. Tracy's mother hadn't looked very pretty there, lying that day underneath the blue sheets. To match her mood and my lips, Tracy had thought. Her mother's hair had been combed straight back. There was no colour in her face. The only flowers were some fading Michaelmas daisies Tracy had bought from the backyard, thinking she could bring something cheerful. Not that her mother appreciated the effort. Mrs. Jenner was out of it that day, except for fixation on staying in the hospital. "I've told Dr. Rothstein that I don't see how I can go home." Not go home, Tracy had repeated stupidly, wondering what that meant for her. She'd arranged to stay with Jan's hospitable family for the 2 nights her mother was to be hospitalised. Generous as she was, Mrs. Brace certainly didn't want Tracy indefinitely. "Is there something wrong with you?" Tracy had asked her mother. "I simply can't face going home." "What did Dr. Rothstein say when you told him?" Tracy's mother had pulled the blue sheet up under her chin and fixed her eyes on the blank television screen hanging perilously on the far wall like a bale of shingles about to topple off a rooftop. "She said we'd talk about it tomorrow. Isn't that muddle-headed? There is nothing to talk about. I'm safer here." Tracy shook her head. She could detect a long, thin finger of fear stroking up her spinal cord, pinching her neck to cut off the flow of air to her lungs. "I can't breathe," she thought. "I can't think. I can't believe this." "You're not safe at home?" she asked, trying to keep her voice from trembling. The next day, Dr. Rothstein reassured Tracy. "Your mother's had it rough," he explained soothingly. "Everything seems too much to her at the moment. I'll have one of our doctors talk to her." Tracy was too shy to punch through Dr. Rothstein's blustery confidence with her puny misgivings. It turned out she was right. Her mother did come home, without ever referring to the incident ever again. Life, or our kind of non-life, as Tracy privately termed her daily existence with her mother, caught them in its spiritless grip again. They'd huddled there together, yet very far apart, until this recent recurrence. Half asleep after our arduous day, Tracy leaned into the lilac cushion and lifted her feet onto the end of the bed. She speculated on Robert's experience at her age. He'd had his father as a buffer, when he was home. But what about that crockery flying through the air? That would frighten a kid. How about that time your mother described a poisoning attempt when you met her at the railway station in 1875? Tracy asked the long-gone Robert Lincoln. And the time you caught her getting into a Grand Pacific Hotel elevator, half-clad. And the time she accused you of trying to murder her. Tracy blanched at the picture she'd drawn in her head, remembering how her mother had dumped the poison egg into the trash and ostentatiously replaced it with a breakfast in which Tracy had had no hand. Tracy wanted to communicate with Robert Lincoln, persuade him she knew how he felt. If your own mother doesn't trust you, then who will? Who can you tell your story to? Tracy was having some trouble with the insanity file. Greedy to glean every fact about Robert Lincoln, her mind still balked at the concept of interdiction, debility of the nervous system, insanity defences, and the necessity of personal restraint. Tracy could tell that Robert Lincoln was only trying to protect her mother from her own excesses. But Mary Lincoln wouldn't let him near her money. Taking incredible pains, she sewed $56,000 in securities in her petticoat pockets. She threatened to leave town for parts unknown. Mary Lincoln wouldn't even give her bonds to her own lawyer, one of the country's best, an old friend, her husband's biographer. The lawyers argued with her, begged her, cajoled her. Finally, when she was exhausted, she stepped to the side of the room and pulled up her outer skirt so the lawyers could finally tear the bonds out of her pockets. Tracy tried to picture the scene and to imagine how Robert Lincoln must have reacted when the jury decided that Mary Lincoln, his mother, was insane. They said insane, but not suicidal. And what was the first thing Mary Lincoln did on leaving the court? Eluding 2 detectives and a strong Irishwoman, Mary Lincoln attempted to buy a combination of laudanum and camphor to kill herself. When the first druggist hesitated at her dangerous request, she hailed a carriage to carry her to a second druggist, and then a third, with one of the detectives and the first druggist on her tail to prevent her suicidal purchase. The first druggist was finally able to slip her a harmless potion of burnt sugar water, which Mary drank, meaning to die. Robbed of her goal, she evaded her guards once again and resumed her quest for poison. Tracy couldn't imagine what Robert Lincoln must have thought when the desperate druggist called him, or how revealed he must have been once he delivered his mother to Bellevue Place in Batavia, Illinois, not far from Chicago, a private sanatorium catering to the metropolis upper crust, a select class of lady patients of quiet, unexceptionable habits. Tracy shared 2 aspects of Robert Lincoln's situation. She knew what it was like to be relieved of the full responsibilities for her mother's care, and also she agreed that the Fox River Valley, where Bellevue Place was located, was the most beautiful country west of New York. She could remember biking along the river around Batavia with Jan and Alan and the other kids on a birding expedition. They hadn't identified a lot of birds. That was hard on a bike. But they were spellbound at the bursting trillium, the leaves leafing out into parasols of green, the windmill dominating the river scene. The magic extended to the hunks of round steak they cooked over wood fires and rolled in buttered bread. The sandwiches were wonderful, like the day. But Mary Lincoln had not liked the Fox River Valley, or Batavia, or the confinement, in spite of the long carriage rides provided every day, or being designated lunatic. She began organising on her arrival for her escape from Bellevue Place. Just when Robert Lincoln finally had a little peace of mind, Tracy was thinking when she heard a rap on the door. Reluctantly, she put down the insanity file and headed for the kitchen. Grandma was describing how helpful Tracy had been. I'm beginning to feel a little better about her, but all this burrowing in her room, that frightens me a little bit. That's what Dorothy used to do. Shouldn't a girl be out more in the fresh air, with her friends? Tracy caught only a scattering of Grandpa's low-pitched reply. Out this morning, fresh air. That's true, Grandma agreed. I'd already forgotten about that with the teacher coming and all. Tracy started. She realised that she had almost forgotten her morning at Crabtree Orchard too, in her pursuit of poor Robert Lincoln. She couldn't wait to get back to him. Until next time, good night.